Good morning. Welcome to 30 Days of Transformation. We're on day 12 today, and the focus is going to be on neuroplasticity. I've been talking about neurobiology and yoga for the past couple of days. Please check out those videos. They're on my Subtle Health page. And today I want to talk about neuroplasticity. So I've been talking about ways in which yoga makes positive changes in the brain and ways in which yoga can help us to come into ourselves in personal transformation, mental health, resilience, these sorts of topics that are so vital for our health and well-being. I do want to make it clear that I don't think the mind and the brain are the same thing. I think the brain is a epiphenomenon of the mind, not the other way around. Because that would be consistent with yoga philosophy or yoga ontology of, who we are as human beings, how we come into existence. If you look at the subtle body is like the blueprint of the physical structure. And when you look at the way that the yogis understood the subtle body, it's so fascinating. They had two petals on this chakra, on the Agya chakra, the sixth chakra, these two petals, obviously there's some correlation to the hemispheres of the brain. But I don't want to get too esoteric or too much into metaphysics today. I really do want to talk about neuroplasticity, but I think it's important. I've heard neuroscientists say the mind is what the brain does, and I just think that's so reductive. And I think it's really important to have a more expansive perspective on who we are as human beings. And the idea that we're just sort of some kind of well-organized clump of DNA and cells, I think is it's just reductive. I don't think it really gives us the fullness of human experience. And also there's people like Rupert Sheldrake, who, the scientists think he's a wacko, but the guy's really interesting, does fascinating experiments, and has demonstrated that the mind exists, outside of the brain, or there are these examples of extracranial thinking or extracranial activity that point to the fact that we can't limit ourselves to this, this 3-pound lump of tofu in our head. Nevertheless, if we can use the mind to change the brain and body, then that is very useful for changing the mind. So, they're very highly interconnected, and we haven't teased out the precise definitions yet, right? But today what I want to talk about is this idea from Dan Siegel, who's a fascinating neuroscientist who also studies mindfulness, and has a book called Mindsight, which I've referenced here. And he talks about 4 ways that the brain changes: repetition, passion, novelty, and focus. And these 4 ways, what I want to do is show you how we do them all the time in our yoga practice. The first one, the easiest one to understand, is repetition. We hopefully do practices more than once in our life, right? We practice every day or maybe several times a week. And then that repetition also happens within the practice. For example, when you're doing asana, the way I teach asana is that there's more than one round, right? So we do several rounds of the pose. And what this does is start to shift maladaptive movement patterns. I'll talk about that more at another time. And it starts to elicit the proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, PNF, and make changes in the structure and in our movement patterns, right? And then repetition, we also use it, for example, in chanting. You repeat the mantra several times. You might do it when you meditate. You say mantra over and over again. You do it when you breathe and pranayama with particular breathing patterns. So repetition is something that's very much woven into the methodology of yoga practice. And neuroscientists are saying it's the primary way that we make changes in the brain. So we make changes by, by repeating, by doing it over and over again. Now, the next bullet point is passion, and it's also called emotional arousal. Now, the way that this works is that there's a part of our brain, the limbic system, that's kind of out there on the lookout for things that are going wrong or just paying attention. It's kind of has this vigilant quality to it to make sure that we're safe. Basically, that's its function, to keep us safe. So, and keep us safe physically and keep us safe emotionally. So when what you're doing is hooked into or linked into some kind of emotional arousal, some kind of a sentiment is what my Indian teachers would have called it, that makes it makes greater changes in the brain. So if you're just saying a mantra, for example, in meditation, if you're just saying a mantra over and over and over again, but you don't know what the mantra means or you're not particularly connected to it, then it certainly doesn't have the same effect as if you have a word or a mantra that feels juicy and alive to you. That hooks our attention and that makes changes in the brain, right? So think about your practice in that sense. And this is where the practice of bhakti or devotional practices are so important, because they link into the emotional and natural human tendency for emotion, this kind of emotional connection. And those practices are super important, and I hope you include them in your practice. Okay, and then another way we make changes to the brain is novelty. So when something is new and interesting, right, that new pair of boots that you saw at the store, or or you saw on Facebook, or that new book that you want to read, something's new, it definitely hooks our attention. So that's why it's so important. One of my teachers says, do the same thing in your practice, but do it differently, so I'm not suggesting that you make much changes to like very patterned and traditional practices like mantra repetition, but doing things differently in your asana practice, whoa, it's so helpful. It's so incredibly helpful. It changes your understanding of your intrinsic movement patterns. It starts to work with different muscle fibers and different fascial trains. There's so much benefit to shifting your meditation practice. I'm sorry, your asana practice, and then pranayama practice. Also, like if you're working with a ratio, like for example, I'm doing 6 counts in, 3 counts pause, 6 counts out, 3 counts pause, but then I mess around with that ratio a little bit. Like I still would have 18 counts in the whole ratio, but I start to play with it a little bit, maybe a slightly shorter inhale, longer exhale, longer suspension after the exhale, shorter retention after the inhale, playing around with it like that. It can be really interesting and have different effects on the nervous system. Okay, and then the last point I want to talk about today, I had 4 bullet points today because Dan Siegel came up with a model, so I thought I'd throw them in. So the last point for today is focus and attention. So we all know that as we develop the attention networks, we are able to guide ourselves to the things that we want to change in ourselves. So when we apply attention and awareness, that starts to make changes in the brain. Specifically, it changes the part of the front brain, orbital frontal lobe, which is right here. I actually heard one neuroscientist say that right here we start to develop more gray matter. I was like, wow, because that's of course, is the 6th chakra, very common meditation point. So focus and awareness, also a function of the it's a function more of parts of the allocortex, part of the outer layer of the front brain. That focus and awareness is part of mindfulness. Of course, there's a lot of research on it. So those are the 4. And how do we use focus and awareness? We use focus and awareness when we meditate. We want to use it when we're interocepting and noticing sensations in the body. I mean, we use it all the time in practices. So these are the 4 ways that the brain changes. I hope this has been helpful for you. I would check out Dan Siegel's book, Mindsight. And to tell you the truth, I don't love his books. I like his YouTube videos a lot better. He's really great lecturer and a lot of fun to listen to. So please leave a comment if you connect with any of these 4 bullet points that have been particularly helpful for you for making changes. I'd love to hear your comments, and I'll see you tomorrow. I'm on my way to Knoxville right now, and I'll see you tomorrow from there, and we'll talk a little bit more about neurobiology and yoga practice. Thanks for being here. Namaste.